Welcome back to Plague Scythe Studios, everyone. Ryan here, next to a very much in progress amplifier shelf build, aka the Tower of Loud. Needs a few more pieces and parts and finishing touches to be truly operational, but we're getting there. Either way, I thought this would be a decent jumping off point to kick off today's topic. And just like a lot of these gear-centric videos recently, this one has spawned from a few comments that I've received over the past few months. And the general theme of all of them have been revolving around guitar gear for different applications, particularly practicing versus performing versus making music. And I would use this as perhaps the absolute worst case scenario for a practice rig. As I'll expand upon shortly, my philosophy for using guitar gear in a studio versus using it in a practice rig or especially a performing rig are all a bit different, but they do share one common thread, and that is they should all be fast to set up and get a guitar tone out of. Whether you're simply practicing a couple scales or riffs that you want to learn, or you have an idea and you want to jot it down on paper or in the digital format as quickly as possible, you don't want to be fumbling around with cables and pedals and headphones and all this stuff. I think 30 seconds or less is kind of the cutoff point for me. Stuff starts taking a minute or especially 5 minutes to get everything routed and get all the settings dialed in. I'm kind of over it at that point. And I'm more likely to be just turning knobs and dialing in new sounds than I am to actually become proficient at guitar or, put down new music ideas, anything of that sort. So obviously, this setup isn't quite conducive to that, although with a few changes and new pieces of gear I hope to implement very soon, that should alleviate some of those problems. But when it comes to learning a new song or tabbing out something that I've written or simply becoming more proficient at the instrument in general, I almost never plug into one of these amplifiers to achieve that. But when I do, during those 90-minute jam sessions, I'm more likely to be inspired to write something new, to come up with a cool rhythm or just a neat sound, something that may not be as technically impressive, but something that is still inspiring for me. And there's definitely an overlap there. And I think that's the sweet spot. For me, that sweet spot has been the Fractal AX8 because it does a wonderful job at sounding like a real amplifier rig, directly recorded. It can be used for any application, whether it's plugging straight into a computer, audio interface, jamming along with tracks there, or recording new ones. Plug into a power amp after disabling the cabinet modeling. You can set it up by scenes if you just want a few different tones within one click away, or if you want to make it operate more like a traditional guitar rig, you can have, say a drive block on this stomp box, or you can have your delay and reverb and amp channel switching and all that stuff. So no matter what mood I'm in, I can kind of make it work in any of those scenarios. And that's why it's been like the most invaluable piece of gear I've owned in a decade, probably my entire time playing guitar, honestly. With that said, I personally wouldn't sacrifice anything that costs more or even less than these contemporary amp modelers, even if they do fulfill both roles rather well. You see a lot of players kind of purging everything they have to fund one of these things. And, that might be fine in some people's use cases. But for me, I think relatively crappy gear like the original pod or even some of the other amp modelers I have can still be really useful because this sounds decent enough on single note passages, especially. And you can quickly get to different sounds depending on what you're going after. And it does have, a few presets to play with. So it doesn't sound good enough that I want to, go after writing my own riffs or my own solos, but it is at least good enough that I don't want to throw my headphones out the window or, kick in the monitor that I'm playing this through. It's adequate. And I honestly think that's what practice gear needs to be, is simply adequate. Because after that, for me at least, my brain chemistry changes. fact, I would go so far to say that my interest in guitar tone and production has probably been the worst thing for my playing by far. It's not to say you can't be an amazing player and have a great guitar tone. They're not mutually exclusive, but there are so many hours in the day. And when you work and make YouTube videos and work on albums and that sort of stuff, then something's got to give, you know? And so I think by the time I was really into perfecting my signal chain and figuring out how this artist sounded this way and how can I apply that to my music, then I quit caring about getting better, especially once I realized, like, you know what, for the music I'm writing, I can already do what I need to do. However, there's been plenty of instances, especially recently, where I can write stuff better than I can play it. So I realized, it's like, yeah, maybe we need to get back on a decent regiment. And the best thing to distract me from that is just jamming on amplifiers like this. And so that's why, for me, at least, it's a kind of a healthy breakaway to plug into something that isn't nearly as nice sounding. Maybe doesn't respond exactly the same. Of course, that's not to say you can't practice through a tube amplifier. Plenty of people do. You know, if you're a one or two pedal through a Vox AC30 kind of guy, and you've got a Strat and Les Paul, that's it. Then yeah, I mean, run scales all day through that. Feel free. But even then, I feel like it would be a sensible move for a lot of those players to have a less capable, say 1x12, 1x8, even solid state combo amplifier that doesn't sound as good on its own, that's kind of less forgiving and makes you be a better player to sound as good. There's no like magical equation of one half guitar playing skill times E to the tone of the amplifier equals your sound or anything. But, in general, you can sound pretty good strumming cowboy chords through a nice tube amplifier, whereas something like a Fender Champ or a Roland Cube may not be quite so pleasant to hear the same thing. But someone who's really technically proficient, you might still say "holy shit" and totally forget about the sound. If you spend most of your time as a bedroom writer or a living room noodler like me, then this stuff isn't quite as crucial. But if you tour or gig semi-professionally, or especially if it's your full-time job, then this stuff can be really important. And I think an equally important subdivision is your rehearsal rig from your actual performing rig. And just like having a different practice rig, I think having something to rehearse through that is easy, quick to tear down, set up, portable, but also mirrors what you'll be using in the live situations, in terms of both tones and flexibility, routing your signal. If you're playing to a backing track and you're working off MIDI and all that, then it's probably best off to just use your actual rig as your rehearsal rig. But, say if you're in the amp modeling space, maybe the full-fledged rack system is what you'll want to take to your performances, and something that sounds the same in a floorboard might be what you want to rehearse with, stuff like that. But even then, I still think a relatively crappy little practice rig would still be very helpful to warm up on. And, as you see plenty of players do, or take it on the bus or hotel room to just get a sound, something that doesn't have to be your exact guitar tone, but something that's good enough to, stay fresh and overall get better. Now, if you think about everything I've described so far and compare it to your typical $1 million plus studio and its mountains of outboard gear and miles of cables, then you might see them as sort of polar opposites. And in some cases, it's kind of true. But I think even at that scale, and especially at this relatively micro scale that I'm setting up here, you can kind of get the best of both worlds. For me, when all of this is done, this entire room, I want to be able to switch everything within, again, that magical less than 30 seconds. Have everything ready to route to the next, whether I want to have this effect through this effect or this one through this one. Be able to plug in a pedal between, this amp and my guitar, or change the input from my guitar to a reamp box or to another guitar, or be able to patch one of the amplifiers to a different cabinet, or route it directly to my computer, or even interface with a wet, dry, wet setup, or plug in an amp modeler into that wet, dry, wet power amp, that sort of thing. That's kind of philosophy I'm going after. And all of these things obviously add cost and complexity and stuff that for a normal sit down and play kind of rig is just foolish, absolutely unnecessary. But for someone who hopefully intends to make this setup more or less permanent for all the music I create going forward, and on top of that, creates videos for this kind of stuff, and that alone makes it worth it, then having that kind of rig wired up, ready to go within a button press will be the difference between making the video I want to or not, or getting that video completed on time, or being able to reamp tracks and getting them to sound exactly the same because everything is right here. Um, that's something I've been looking forward to for a long time. But I'm not getting rid of my little crappy practice gear, and I'm damn sure not getting rid of the AX8. And at the end of the day, whatever you're doing, if it's not fun, you're not doing it right. You need to change your routine at least, and perhaps your gear as well. You know, there is kind of that floor for your practice gear. If it's so bad that you can't have a good time playing it, then you need to change some stuff up. But at the end of the day, practicing is sort of like work. It's still fun work for me, but I'm not going to put all that stress and just unnecessary hours on an amplifier like this when ultimately I can do the same thing on something that, you know, when it goes bad, it goes bad. But $40 used compared to over a grand or easily two for a lot of tube amplifiers out there. Yeah, that's a much smarter decision for me. And when I want to play out loud like an idiot and headbang and have a sore neck in the morning and tinnitus, then I'll do that and I will have nothing but fun then. But yeah, I'm not going to spend 30 minutes hooking up cables and setting up a perfect pedal board to um, practice a Holdsworth solo. It's not logical for me. So that's kind of my outlook on different guitar rigs, why you tend to see a bias of certain things on this channel. You see more of the recording guitarist perspective because that's what I spend a lot of my time as. But there is something to be said for different classes of gear when it comes to practicing, rehearsing, and especially performing. So that's about that. Any other questions, comments, as always, please leave them down below. Maybe you'll give me another video idea. Thank you for that as always. We'll see you next time. Bye.